everybody, and welcome to this portion of our Hay Station and Levengood Station community tour. First of all, I want to give the photo credit out to Brian Gregg. If you like his photos, he has some fabulous pictures of trains from all over northern Kentucky, and I think even some further south. You can find his work on Flickr.com. That's FLICKR.com, Flickr. And you can just Google his name, Brian Gregg, and find that. I will try to post a link in the comments or in the description of this program showing you where to go to find his work. The area that we're going to talk about today consists of about 800 acres, roughly. The amounts told are vary. Around 1792, Dr. Monroe, who was Falmouth's first doctor, and a surveyor by the last name of Fraser, came to this area that we now call the Hayes Valley. They were the first two residents in this valley. To leave the valley and to get to town, people had to cross the river twice, and that would be the South Fork of the Licking River. The first road was really just a footpath, a trail. It was dug by enslaved men. The road was widened over time until it finally would accommodate wagons and buggies. And then later on, the railroad came through the valley. This caused a little problem with the roads. So to kind of compensate the residents for that, they made a stop in Levengood and provided transportation into town for the residents. So you would go to town in the morning and you could come back in the afternoon or the evening on the same train. This area where we have the red boxes is going to reflect the main portion of our tour. The first stop is going to be up here at the top of our map. It's the County Almshouse Farm. You're going to hear me call it the poorhouse, the county infirmary, the county farm. It's all the same thing, okay? So I'm going to make that really clear. The Hayes Distillery was roughly, this is an 1884 precinct map. It was drawn by DJ Lake. If you've been on other tours with me and you've seen these maps, I use the DJ Lake and the precinct map interchangeably, but it was done in 1884. It's the oldest map I know of Pendleton County, and it is broken out by precincts. And it does have the names of the people who live in each precinct at that time, who lived there. So roughly, the Hayes Distillery had not yet come to Hayes Station in 1884. So its rough location would be about here where T. Crotty is. And and on below that probably. It's just a rough idea. It's not exact, okay? Near that is a schoolhouse. You can maybe see that, and it gives a number. I think it says number 2. I do not have any information on the school at Levengood, but this was a white school, okay? And it's, when I get to the Levengood portion of the tour, I couldn't enlarge it enough for you to see it and include that school. So that's why I'm pointing it out right now to you. And then the last stop is actually going to be Levengood proper, as I would call it. So we just wanted to kind of give you an idea where we're going. And as you can see, this is the South Fork of the Licking River coming through here. The County Almshouse and Farm. This is a picture of it. It is believed to have been built by Thomas J. Oldham, and it did consist of 14 rooms. Oldham built several buildings in downtown Falmouth in that time frame, so I think that's why he gets credit for it. It's kind of in his style. The infirmary was built prior to the Civil War, and the bricks were made in the area. At some point, they painted it white. Also, at some point, a wooden addition was added as a residence for caretakers who had families and wanted to live on the property. There were those who stayed at the house. They were there on a temporary basis. You know, they just were down on their luck. Maybe sometimes you see widows and maybe they remarried and were able to get out of the almshouse. And others you're going to find are long-term residents. Many of these folks were elderly. The county supported the home with tax dollars, And the caretakers raised crops, including the food eaten at the infirmary. Some of the more able-bodied residents would help out with whatever they were able to do. They might have prepared meals, cleaned up dishes, tended gardens, that kind of thing. The caretakers raised crops that included tobacco, corn, hay, potatoes, and fodder. Mr. Charles Ruber and his son Ed were the managers and the assistant manager between 1902 and 1910. And they reported that during this time, they cared for 44 different individuals, 9 of whom died while they were still running the farm. If people lived there and died and they didn't have anyone who could afford to bury them somewhere else, or if they had no family at all, they were buried there on the farm. There were 2 cemeteries located on the farm. My understanding is one was near the house and one was up closer to where the road is today. There are no markers left at either of those cemeteries, and I believe that there's just one cemetery listed on Find a Grave because they really don't know who's buried where. Sometimes children lived here. If they lived here with their parents, they stayed in the same room as their parents. They did have a swing that they could swing on, and they were given broken dishes that they could play with. Children who were physically able, meaning they were well and big enough physically to do some tasks, were usually tasked with bringing in water from the well and bringing in coal. Major Bishop was a caretaker there from 24 until 36. And then in January of 1940, according to census records for that year, and a family tradition, Roy McClanahan became the caretaker. The building was actually torn down in 1975, and it was located now on what we call the County Farm Road, which is just off Hayes Station, and it was near the riverbank. This is a Google map shot of where the property it would have been on. Here is Hayes Station Road coming here, and then this is the County Farm Road that comes down through here and ends kind of abruptly there. And as you can see, it's all farmland today. This is private property, and there's nothing back there to see. That's just the location. I went through the census looking to kind of try to put together a list of people who may have lived there. Find a Grave also has people that are listed there that are not on the census records. So if you're interested in, or maybe you know or you've heard that one of your family members may have been there, I would suggest that, and then the census records here. Prior to 1900, there was no 1890 census that has survived. Okay, there was a census, it didn't survive, it was burned in a fire. And prior to that, the 1870, 60, 70, and 80 census, I could not make heads or tails as to where the infirmary was. A lot of times, they didn't, for occupation, they would list inmate for these people. An inmate simply meant they were staying there. It does not mean they were imprisoned. Okay, we like to think of inmate as being imprisoned, but you could be hospitalized and be called an inmate during the census. So they didn't put any kind of thing like that on the census in those years. And I could not, like I said, I couldn't make heads or tails to figure out who was there prior to 1900. So I go from 1900 on. Just a little bit about some of these folks. I didn't do a whole lot of research on the individuals, but some of them I kind of was familiar with or intrigued me enough that I did go ahead and spend a little time researching them. You'll notice David Fogel on here. He died at Eastern State Hospital in 1902, and he is buried there. So he didn't live too much longer after 1900. He was a Civil War veteran of the Confederate Army. He was in the Company D of the 4th Kentucky Cavalry. Riley Carr was, he lived to be 80 years old, and he died in 1909 at the age of 80. His mother died, and eventually his father and another brother went to live with one sister, and he went to live with the other sister. The other sister that he was living with died in 1901. So my best guess is she was probably not well, and they put him in the infirmary at that time because she died not too long after this census was taken. Maybe 6 or 7 months. I think she died in February, and this was done in the summer months. He and the brother that lived with the other sister were listed as idiots, which meant they had mental disabilities in previous census records. According to the Barton papers, he also had some physical disabilities as well. The extent they referred to him as club-footed, which would have impaired his ability to walk. So that was him, Jack Wells and Mary Gray, and Arthur Yeager. You're going to see them on another census, at least one other, maybe even more. On the right side, you see Florence Thompson, a 2-year-old child, Raymond Thompson, an infant, and you see Ida Thompson, 25. Not knowing these people, I assume that she's probably their mother. Florence was transported on the orphan train to the Kentucky Children's Home by the order of Judge Guy Fawcett on the 15th of December, 1906. So I'm not sure what happened to Raymond or their mother, either one. And Belle Jacobs was also another child, and I was not able to get anything much on her. Then in 1910, there's Jack Wells again, and it says, and Arthur Yeager as well. So there's Arthur again, meaning that they both were there at least 10 years. You know, Mary Graves, I kind of think that somebody wrote that wrong. I looked at the actual handwriting, and I get where the transcriber got Graves out of it, because it does look like Graves, and maybe it is Mary Graves, but it may be Mary Gray. And you'll see why I think that a little bit later. Lizzie Fogel, I'm assuming, could have been the mother of these Fogel children. There are four of them. George and Annie Fogel were also transported on the orphan train to the Kentucky Children's Home. This was ordered by Judge E.S. Clark on the 19th of January, 1911. Rebecca Thompson is going to show up again too. So 1920, there's Rebecca Thompson and there's Mary Gray. That's why I think the previous one may have been Gray and not Graves. However, it could be a different Mary Gray, and it could be that Mary Gray was there 2 different times. But if you're a researcher of hers, you probably want to look into that possibility. Ed Johns is another one who's going to show up on another census. 1930. Also, Joshua and Maddie Smalley and Lawson and Sally Bishop. I do not know if they're husband and wife or brother and sister or cousins or what the relationship is. I just put them together to kind of conserve some space on my slide and let my print be a little bigger. Levi Sargent is going to also show up on another census, and so will Sally Bishop. And there you see both of them, Levi and Sally here. Drusilla Bloom is also going to be someone who shows up more another time, and so will Frank Cushman, 1950. You see both of them over here. Drusilla Bloom, I do know, is buried there. And if you want to look into the burials at the infirmary, they are, as I said, on Find a Grave. This is a link for you. Again, there are no individual stones at that cemetery. Okay, and now for the next portion of our tour, we are going to talk about the Hayes Distillery and Timothy Hayes. Ellen Crotty, who is the great-granddaughter of Timothy Hayes, is going to be here to do that, to talk to us about him.
I'm going to talk to you about Timothy Hayes, my great-grandfather. He was born December the 10th, 1843, in Cappamore, County Limerick, Ireland. And that date is right in the middle of the Irish famine. His parents were John Hayes and Julia Smith. We really know very little about his mother, Julia. All we know is that she died when Timothy was very young. And then his father, John, decided he was going to immigrate to the U.S. and he was going to leave Timothy in Ireland, and then after he got established, he was going to send for him. But John did travel to the U.S., but he was never heard from again. So they think he either died aboard ship or, possibly after he landed in the U.S. So then at some point, Timothy immigrated to Canada, and we don't know exactly when. I've seen some family history that says he did that at age 15. But on the census records, some say he immigrated in 1851, 1861. We just don't know. He did hook up with his Spellman relatives, and I did locate them on the 1871 Canadian census. They had a distillery in Ontario, and he's with them. So I think I found him there. His obituary says that he was in Cincinnati by 1873. He was associated with the GAF, that's GAFF distillery, and that later became the Mill Creek Distilling Company. And he was there and became finally superintendent. He was there for 25 years. And he also, at some point, was associated with the Storrs Distilling Company. That's STORRS. And from the research that I've done, most of these distilleries were on the west side of Cincinnati. And that's where he lived when he was in Cincinnati as well. In 1878, he married my great-grandmother, Julia Sullivan, in Cincinnati. Her father, Patrick Sullivan, worked in the distilling industry, and I kind of wonder if that may be how Julia and Timothy met. Just speculation on my part, but it seems like a possibility. On the 1880 census, it shows that Timothy had the occupation of yeast maker. And one article that I saw said that he traveled from one distillery to another as a yeast maker. But then again, another article says he was at the Mill Creek Distilling Company for 25 years. So anyway, he was distilling. In 1881, he was involved in an altercation shortly before Christmas that could have changed the direction of my life, because he was struck with a brick in the head, and they really didn't give him any hope of living. But obviously he did, and we're glad for that turn of events. Then later in the 1880s, he purchased land in Pendleton County. The earliest deed on a date I've seen is about 1885. And initially, he owned a farm and a house at Levengood. And his father-in-law, Julia's parents, Patrick and Ellen Sullivan, and their daughter Mary Ann, they lived at Levengood and took care of the farm and the house, because the Hayeses would travel back and forth between Levengood and Cincinnati. his oldest daughter, Marcella, left some good information in a letter. She was born in 1885, and because her mother was having some health problems, she came to stay with her grandparents and her aunt at Levengood when she was about 1.5 years. So she loved it there, and she describes the farm and the buildings and the house and sitting on the front porch listening to the trains go by. She mentions the farm hands, where there was a building for them to live in, and mentions them, eating in the dining room and things like that. When she became old enough to go to school, she went back to Cincinnati. And then she said that after she and her sisters finished school, they came back to Falmouth or Levengood to live in the house. And also, while they were in school, they would come and stay during the summers. About 1903, and this is documented in a lot of the local history, Timothy established the Hayes Valley Distillery. And around this same time, he built a new house, and it was, from what I know, a 3-story house and high ceilings, and a great house. And also, as I understand, it was located behind where Alice and Ormond Conrad's house was, the one that they built after they bought land there. Even though Timothy established the distillery, he was continuing with a lot of other ventures. And so by this time, his 2 oldest sons, Ed and Arthur, were looking to start a career. So they were operating the distillery. He owned it. And Arthur lived here. He and his wife, and their 2 children, Arthur Jr. and Jefferson, were born here. So, Aunt Marcella said that, as I said, after the girls finished school, the family moved back to Hayes Station. It's kind of hard to keep up with them because from one census to the other, they had a different address in Cincinnati. So it seems like they were quite mobile. I guess they kept their closets clean that way. So, in addition to the distillery business, there were a lot of cattle there because they ate the used mash. In 1906, this distillery caught fire, and it actually burned the distillery and a lot of the cattle pens. And the articles say that it was about a $20,000 loss. So when you think about it, that was only about 3 years after it started. And also 78 head of cattle were lost. So that was significant. But Timothy did rebuild the distillery, and they said he built it even bigger and better. So that was in 1906. Actually, there's not a lot of detailed information that I have. I've seen a couple of articles where they had significant livestock sales and significant whiskey sales. So it seemed like it was doing very well. In October 1912, Timothy Hayes died suddenly. He died of a stroke. So that was that was a big change. And the farm was sold several years later, and it was listed at 559 acres. And I noticed that there several men bought land. John Coleman bought the parcel with the residents in the distillery. And I know my mother did visit the house one time when the Colemans were there, so she was definitely impressed with it. In October 1915, Julia Hayes died. So at this point, the Hayeses were back in Cincinnati. The two sons, Ed and Arthur. He had Timothy and Julia had 7 children in total. Marcella, the one I mentioned, she settled in St. Louis. And Ellen, who we called Aunt Nell, lived in Cleveland. My grandmother, Mary Beatrice, married Thomas Crotty, and of course she lived in Pendleton County. The brother Oliver Joseph, he went by Joe, he was in the Independence area, and the youngest son, William, was in Cincinnati. So before his death, in addition to the distilleries, Timothy did a lot of real estate transactions. I was surprised to see in the obituary that he had owned the Fountain Square Theater, which I think later was known as the Columbia Theater. And I thought, when I was a young woman and going to the theater in Fountain Square, I had no idea that there was any family tie there. I also found a article describing how he and some other investors were gonna get involved in a mining operation out west. But so it just seemed like he was very active and doing all sorts of things. He was also active in many Cincinnati organizations, including the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, Irishman that he was. During his time with the distilling business, he secured several patents. I guess that's what you would say, secured. I found 5, and they were primarily for improving the way yeast could ferment, and that would expedite the whole distilling process. One of them was for the process of making and cooling mash. He had an apparatus for mashing grain. And I'm impressed by the diagrams. He had a patent on an apparatus for cooling mash. 2 of those. And the last one was a means for gaining dry feed from distillery slop. So he was using everything. And as I said, I found 5 patents. I don't know if he had any more than that. So during that period, they established a post office at Hayes Station. I've seen some mentions that maybe he built it. I don't know. I didn't know that private citizens built post offices, but anyway, they had the post office there. Also, I think it was like around 1911, they constructed a new bridge, and that was really a positive for all the residents along Hayes Station, because they said during the winter it was almost impassable to get through there. So those were some of the things that were happening. But I remember my aunt Marcella said that once the post office was there, the railroad would deliver the mail and newspapers, and people would come. And also another development was the fact that after the fire in 1906, when the distillery was being rebuilt, they put in the railroad put in a spur there. So that was another improvement for the area. And then finally, of course, the Hayes family no longer owned that property, but finally in 1940, what remained of the distillery was struck by lightning. So there was a second fire. So I'm not sure if the Colemans still owned the property at that time, or it's changed hands several times.
Thank you, Ellen, for that very informative presentation on Timothy Hayes. There's just a couple of things I want to add to that. One was about the post office. She did mention that Timothy Hayes built a post office there at Levengood, or Hayes Station, as it was known by that time. I can't tell you anything much about that. There was a post office at Levengood when Peter Levengood lived there. I don't know if the post office that Timothy Hayes built was in a different location. Maybe the old one was in bad shape and he just built a new one. Or maybe there was literally no mail service there for a period of years. And then when they came back, they just built a new one. I can't account for that. So I did want to throw that out there if that's something of interest to you. I didn't, there was a little bit of a discrepancy there, and I've seen that about Timothy Hayes before. I'm not saying that her presentation was wrong. She's right. But I just don't know how that came about. The next thing I wanted to show you is a map. This map is part of the collection of John R. Godman, and I believe it is a microfilm copy because it's very blurry, even in the paper form that he's printed out. But I inserted it here because I found it interesting. It says the Hayes Farm, Pendleton County, Kentucky, Atlantic Coast Realty Company, Greenville, North Carolina. I have no idea what that is all about. There is a date on it, but it is so blurry I could not read the date, even looking at the paper. And a magnifying glass, I've tried everything. I've tried enlarging it. It doesn't happen. That's why I think it's microfilm, because the technology has not always been that good. As you can see in the center here, this was the Hayes Distillery, and it does mark the buildings here, which I thought was kind of interesting. Not really sure why they have a map of it, but I thought I would just share it because it is kind of interesting. So now we will go on to our last stop, which is Levengood Station, which was later known as Hayes Station. Peter Carlos Levengood was the progenitor of this family for whom the area is named. He was born in Nicholas County, Kentucky on the 23rd of October, 1795. He married Catherine Orr in Bourbon County on the 24th of December, 1818. Levengood died of typhoid in August of 1848 and was buried on his farm here at Levengood. His tombstone was moved to Riverside about 75 years after he died. So you will find his tombstone on Find a Grave, but he's not there. At the time of his death, the Levengoods had 8 living children. They were Isaac, George, Margaret, Elizabeth, Peter Andrew, Catherine, Nathan, and Alexander Campbell. We'll be talking a little bit about Isaac, who married Margaret Earls. and their son Peter a little bit later on. Levengood purchased 9 tracts of land in this area, and those 9 tracts totaled out to be 1,432 acres. 600 of those acres were purchased from Alexander Monroe. Levengood also enslaved a number of people. To settle his estate, a mother and her 3 children were sold as a unit at the courthouse steps for a total of $1,275. Richard Stowers was the purchaser. On the 1850 census, just roughly 2 years after his death, his wife reported the land value at $4,840. This is a picture of the house. It was log and later was covered with clapboard. It burned to the ground in 1984. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms. The downstairs had a parlor in the center with the dining room, the slave dining room, and a kitchen on the left, and an enclosed porch on the right. I have another picture here. It's not a great picture of the house, and I didn't put it in here to show you the house, but to show you the railroad. It runs right in front of the house. Now, this Peter Levengood is the son of Isaac, as I mentioned earlier. He was born at Levengood on the 6th of December, 1841. Isaac, his father, ran a general store at Levengood, and Peter was the postmaster. Peter also, I believe, ran a store there as well at one point. He sold out his property and holdings in Levengood, settled his debts, and moved to Missouri. He left his children behind, at least for a period of time. I'm not sure if they ever joined him or not, but a guardian was appointed for them here in Pendleton County. And this is a picture of a Levengood family reunion at Levengood. The gentleman on the far left with the white beard and has his hand on the dog was identified as Peter Levengood. Not real sure which Peter it would be, because they said Peter Carlos had a son, Peter Andrew, and he had a nephew, Peter as well, or grandson for Peter Carlos. This is just a close-up of the precinct map. The post office at Levengood was first established on the 3rd of July, 1866, and William H. Scott was the postmaster. As mentioned before, Peter Levengood served in this capacity. Christopher Cockrell was also a postmaster. He is the Cockrell in the Cockrell and Dunaway, the C.C. Dunaway and Cockrell, C.C. Cockrell and Dunaway right here, and also the C.C. Cockrell right here between the store and post office and section house. Christopher Columbus Cockrell was born on the 27th of March, 1813 in Fayette County, and he died at Levengood on April 17th, 1900. He's buried at Riverside. His wife was Lucy Gallup. She was from Cincinnati, and they married in 1850. They had 2 children born in Newport, a third in Cincinnati, and the remainder were born in Pendleton County. Cockrell wore several hats. At age 16, he went to Cincinnati, where he learned the tanner's trade. Then he went into saddle and harness making and worked at that profession for 14 years. At that time, he and a brother entered the steamboat trade. They owned several steamboats, and they ran the Mississippi and the Red Rivers. He gave up the riverboat business when he married, and at that time, he became a bookkeeper for his uncles, S. and S.S. Clark, in Cincinnati. He moved to Levengood in 1854, became a farmer, a merchant, served as postmaster for over 30 years, and was also a railroad agent. Then the grist mill is right here. It says G Mill. That was a water-powered mill. At one time, it was operated by Bucky Blassingame. And Bucky, according to the story in the Barton papers, went blind. And that's how the place got its name, Blind Buck. So even in the early Falmouth Outlooks, you will see a society column from Blind Buck. And that's where it was. It was this area right here where the grist mill was. So basically, the social column from Blind Buck was Levengood news. KCRR was the first railroad to come through Pendleton County, through Pendleton County, but through Hayes and Levengood there. They provided a section house that was to house the men working on the railroad. Later on, the L&N Railroad acquired this track, and it was known as the L&N by the time Timothy Hayes arrived on the scene. In building the railroad through the valley, the road was damaged. And to compensate people who lived there for this, the railroad made a stop twice a day. They made one, and they carried passengers into Falmouth. So you would go to Falmouth in the morning and come back home in the evening. And I should back up and say that in the 1950s, the residents of the area reported to E.E. Barton that part of the grist mill was still visible in the river if the river was low enough. Now, there was also, I've already mentioned about the county school, and the colored church and school would have been right here. It's kind of blurred, but it's right here near the grist mill. The words are near the grist mill. It's actually on up here. And then, of course, the Monday family we're going to talk about, and we see some Mondays listed here. I've not been able to determine who that is by the first initial. So we're going to go and look at those places as well. This came from the Kentucky State Gazetteer and Business Directory for 1876 and 7. It reports that Levengood had a population of 25 people. It erroneously states that it was on the North Fork of the Licking River. It's not, it's on the South Fork. It mentions the Kentucky Central Railroad having a station there, that they received daily mail. And in the business section, you see C.C. Cockrell is running a general store. He is also the postmaster. L.B. Watson is the miller. So he was shipping flour and meal, possibly also shipping corn. Farmers in the area may have also been shipping corn as well at that time. We see 2 teachers listed, R.H. Stewart, who would have taught at the white school, and C. Knox, who would have been at the African-American school. I couldn't find anything really on those 2 individuals. I don't even know what C. Cox's first name was, or R.H. Stewart for that matter. So I'm assuming that I didn't find Knox in any of the census records around that time. I'm assuming he did not stay here long, and that way he didn't show up in a census. I did learn a little bit from the notable Kentucky African Americans database by the University of Kentucky. The first colored school in Pendleton County was probably the American Missionary Association School, which was supported by the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, and was probably here sometime between 1866 and 1870. The first school mentioned in the thesis of Elbert Wallace Richmond, which was entitled A History of Education in Pendleton County, says that this school was established around 1878 in Falmouth. The teacher, and he listed the names of the teachers in Falmouth at that time. By 1885, however, there were 2 other schools. One of those was the Levengood School. So by it being on the 1884 precinct map, I would say it was here before 1884 even, but the first time he found any record of it was in 1885. The other one was at Clay's Run. And if you're not familiar with the area, would have been on Highway 22, just not too far off of 27. The first colored school report for the 3 districts in Pendleton County was filed in 1888. That time, in 1888, the school was about 3 months. Sessions were 3 months long. And the average monthly salary for the teachers in all 3 schools was $25. By 1900, 2 of the schools had closed, and one of those was the school at Levengood, and the other was Clay's Run. So Falmouth remained by 1900 as the only school open to African Americans. The county school board provided transportation for kids out in the county to attend the school in Falmouth. I don't know what that entailed. At Levengood, probably they rode the train because it would come in the morning and they could get on in the morning and go back in the afternoon. Kids at Clay's Run was a little different story, probably. I took this picture with my back to the grave of William Munday. The Monday family was a very prominent African-American family in the Levengood area. This is presumably land they lived on at that time. The first direct line of the Monday family to come to Pendleton County was Daniel Monday. He came here from Bourbon County. He had gained his freedom from James McCrory, and that is spelled McCrory, sometime prior to 1830. He appears in the census in Pendleton County in 1850 for the first time. William Monday was his son, and he was in the U.S. Colored Troops, and he is buried. I was literally standing, as I said, with my back to his grave when I took this picture. They had another son, James, who also joined the Union Army, and James died while in service, and we don't know where he is buried. There were also, and I'm just going to throw this out for research purposes, there were also some other Mondays here before Daniel. They were free people of color. The earliest is George Monday. I did not find his original will. It's not in the index, but it's there somewhere. I'm just going to have to flip page by page to find it probably. But he deeded land to his son, who's also named James, on the 27th of September, 1828, and he deeded it for love and affection. He also deeded off his chattel property, livestock, tools, household goods. James, they both were listed as being of Bourbon County, so I'm not sure if they lived here. I mean, you own land, I would think you would, but they never appear here in the census. It's always in Bourbon County, and that includes the son, James. I learned that this land was purchased from the Garretts of Callinsville, but Thomas L. Garrett owned a lot of land in that area, and I've not been able to, like I said, track that. I learned that by a deed that James Monday wrote when he sold the property, and he sold it in 1847 to the heirs of Richard Lowe, a free man of color, and William Powers. And that's where the deed dried up again for me. So I was able to track it to James, and from James to the heirs of Richard Lowe, and that's where it kind of died. I don't know who the heirs of Richard Lowe are. We're trying to decide that. So back to William Monday that I just briefly mentioned. He was a private in the 100th U.S. Colored Troop Infantry. And as you can see, he's joined at Covington. He was 21 years old, and he joined in May of 1864, which is when this unit was formed. A total of 1,403 men were enlisted in this unit. This regiment. They saw guard duty on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad in Tennessee from the time they mustered in until December of 1864. They participated in some skirmish activity on the railroad in September of 1864. They also saw action at Johnsonville on November the 4th and 5th, at the Battle of Nashville on December 15th and 16th, and at Overton Hill on December the 16th of 1864. They were engaged in the pursuit of John Bell Hood to the Tennessee River on December 17th through the 28th. And then they went back to guard duty on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad in January of 1865. And that's where they stayed until they mustered out on December 26, 1865. William Monday mustered out with his company on that date. On the 8th of June, 1864, he was part of a detachment of recruits assigned to Captain Musey in Nashville, Tennessee. While he was there, he apparently lost a haversack and some other equipage, which is unidentified as specifically. And by the time he mustered out, he owed the government $62.06. All Union soldiers were supposed to be paid every 2 months when they were in the field, but they were lucky if they got paid every 3 or 4 months. And sometimes they went 6 or 8 without being paid. And that was such the case with William Monday. I think by the time he got his last check, according to his service record, it had been 6 months since his previous check. U.S. colored troops were paid $10 a month, and $3 was deducted for a clothing allowance. So they got a net pay of $7 a month. So if he owed $62 when he got out, he worked a lot of months to pay that. The white counterparts in the Union Army were paid $11 a month, so $1 more, until 1864. And in 1864, they got a $5 a month raise. White soldiers were also given a $3 clothing allowance. That was on top of the monthly pay rather than being deducted. William Monday returned to Pendleton County, and in 1886, he married Susan Ramsey. In 1887, so about a year later, he appeared before Pendleton County Court applying for a pension. He reported his age as being 48 years old. And I'm going to read you what someone who was in service with him said in their deposition in his favor, because it's good to hear it in his words. In the service and in the line of his duty at Nashville in the state of Tennessee, on or about the 15th day of January, 1865, he had his right foot frozen, causing the flesh to rot under the toes of the right foot, drawing leaders of his toes and the ends of his toes to rot off, and that he received a bayonet wound in his left leg in the fight at Nashville, and that he contracted a lung affection instead of infection of the right lung, is badly afflicted, and that he was never treated in any hospital during the service. Monday himself went on to say that he resided in Falmouth, that he worked as a laborer ever since he returned from the Army. He reported that he was in good health prior to joining the military, and he worked as a farmer even then. Considered himself half disabled from manual labor because of injuries received during the war. William Southgate of Falmouth was his pension lawyer, and William Southgate was also a free person of color, and he did serve in the U.S. colored troops as well. It appears that this pension was denied because, again, he applies in 1891 and states that he's now 2/3 disabled. And his reason was disease of his feet, the result of being frozen while in service, and bayonet wound of the left leg, rheumatism, and disease of breast and general debilitation. Whether he got that or not, I don't really know, but I do know that in August of 1899, his wife filed for a widow's pension. She did get a widow's pension of $8 a month. She reported that her rent was $4 a month. She said that he had passed away on the 12th day of August, 1899, and that he had died of what we would now call a cerebral hemorrhage or a stroke, paralysis, and general debilitation. She said that neither of them owned real estate, and their personal property was valued somewhere between $15 and $20. She was removed from the pension roll, indicating that she had died by this date. And that date was the 20th of April, 1901. That's as close as we can get to an exact date for her as of now. There's always hope. And so in wrapping up, I want to show you the lands owned by Peter Levengood. I believe this map came out of the Pat Brewster book on the Levengood family originally, and Seibert has kind of modified it to show who wound up with the land, and basically. You can see he started numbering down here at the old mill, and up here at the top is Peter C. That's Peter Carlos Levengood. He purchased land from these individuals between 1825 and 1840. Everybody has a list of acreage here except Andrew White. So then down here is the key to this map. You see numbers 1 through 7 on the left, who purchased it, and if he knew how many acres and the year, if he knew that at the time he did this particular map. So you can see how it was divided. The bridge is right here. Okay. And this, I have to laugh at Old Carr Farm. That's car with 2 R's. And not like what you drive, car with 2 R's. And yes, I know I'm going to get questions because somebody will notice it and say, so yes, that was my great grandfather, John Wilson Carr, who purchased that land. When he purchased it, the family was living on Ironworks Pike in Fayette County, and they had moved there from Pendleton County, and then I guess got enough money together to come home and buy some property. And my grandfather was 10 and his brother was 8. Next oldest brother. They were the two oldest, Grandpa and Holly. My grandfather was Tom. They were sent a day ahead of the family with a team of horses and a wagon full of furniture. And they got somewhere around Paris and broke a wagon wheel. And a farmer came out to help them. He thought they were too young to be on the road by themselves, and he held them up until their parents caught up with them the next day. And then they traveled together then on to Hayes. Numbers 2 and 3 here were owned by the Bishops. That would be Stanley and his brother, I believe. And then the Conrads, this would have been Ormond Sr., and his wife owned this tract here, number 4. 5 would have been Hedermans, and 6 Scheitzes. And then, like I said, the Carr place here. And that concludes our tour today of Levengood and Hayes. I hope you learned something you didn't know before, and thank you for joining us.